joined, all right. So like I was saying, every time I'm showing you these images, my idea is not to tell you, oh, look how many museums got it wrong while I got it right. My idea is for all of you to reflect on what implications can these wrong attributions have on the kind of work that you do probably, or the kind of work that any people in your circle, in archaeological circles do. What implications do they have on researchers, on archaeological research, historic research, art historic research? And what implications does it have on the museum itself as a repository of objects and as a place for research? So have that in mind, because we're going to discuss this at the end of the session. And hopefully I'll hear from all of you about this. But coming back to the ambiguous provenance again, where Bhairav has been wrongly identified as Kali. So yet another faulty provenance, and interestingly from the V&A Museum again. This has been described as the timid Radha. And much to my chagrin, this is a picture that has no inscriptions. So a while ago, I was showing you a Shahnama picture that has inscriptions and that tells you exactly what it is. I also showed you a Radha figurine saying at the back of this, it says it's the tearful Radha, but rather than going verbatim, tell me what Naika it is. Here, interestingly, there is no inscription that tells you what it is. It's just been assumed that this is the timid Radha. And why is she timid? Nobody knows. There is Krishna in the background, but he doesn't really appear like Krishna to me, because Krishna is supposed to be dark-skinned and he was generally portrayed in blue color. Here, of course, there's a white man sitting in the background, not essentially white, but a wheatish complexion man. And there are two ladies leading another woman into a chamber, and she doesn't really look like she's timid. She looks like she's ashamed. Now, if you read Naika Bhed with Bharat's Natya Shastra or Rasik Priya in mind, you'll find that there is a particular Naika who has been caught visiting her lover, and she's now risked her image in the society and among people, and she's now being ushered home in absolute disgrace. Now, this is the Abhisarika Naika, the one who risks infamy or who risks being humiliated publicly for just seeing her lover for a particular moment in time. And as you can see, the women leading her into a separate house, not the same house, and she's being ushered inside. But the museum has gone on to identify her as the timid Radha instead of the Abhisarika Naika. And if you were somebody studying only the Abhisarika Naika representations, and if you were looking it up online, this image would never ever appear on your search results because of the museum provenance, saying absolutely stark, different provenance towards it. So now that we've seen so many instances of wrong provenance, let's come to the implications of wrong provenance in object analysis. So if you're somebody like me, who's essentially dealing with objects day in and day out and trying to classify those objects into one particular category so that they can be visually studied together, you will find that a wrong provenance completely upsets the entire object biography. If it's wrongly identified, it will be wrongly attributed to a different text or a different context altogether. If the context has been upset, then it becomes unreadable for an archaeologist, because context is primitive to all archaeology. It is absolutely essential to all archaeology. If you don't have context, you can't study anything. You can't study a site, you can't study an object. And for context, just having the date line right isn't important. Another thing that I'm sure all of you have noticed, all of these tell you that this is the Kangra School of Art, or this is the Mandi School of Art, or for example, a sculpture here is from Karnataka, or from a particular period, but it doesn't tell you exactly where it's from. So if it's Radha as the Khandit Naika, what folio is this a part of? Is this a folio of the Geet Govind? Is it a different folio altogether? There are so many parallels that are visually so similar, it doesn't give you the complete provenance. Now, that is also very, very problematic to researchers, because when you are trying to study an object in relation to its entire cultural biography, that particular missing information just means that your object is now open to multiple interpretations, and you can go any which way with your interpretation. So whatever appeals to you as a researcher or whatever is the first result that comes to your mind, you can very gladly go with that conclusion, and you can have nobody oppose you on that because nobody knows any better. And that is not scientific. That's not how archaeological research has to be attempted at all. Strictly speaking, wrong provenance upsets the entire object biography, rendering an object unreadable and useless for research. It also means that if the object is wrongly classified and wrongly analyzed, like I said, you're open to any conclusions that may seem fit to you. You might end up writing something about the object. If you're a person of power, prestige, or if your research gets a lot of attention from a lot of people everywhere, your wrong interpretation can be canonized tomorrow. And that is essentially how the object is now going to be understood for all of posterity. So regardless of what the object originally was, regardless of what its cultural biography was, now your interpretation is something that the object has to live with for the rest of its life. And that's not really fair to the object. I do realize that while I speak as an object analyst, I always talk about it's not fair to the object, or it's not fair to the site. But as researchers of archaeology and history, this is who we are doing the service to. We are not trying to write about something or talk about something to make a name for ourselves. We are trying to bring these things back on the global archaeological map. So if I've interpreted something wrongly, this is going to be canonized further. And this is then going to become primary source for somebody else who's going to read my paper and probably, venture out into this particular thing. And that's very, very problematic because that's completely upsetting the scientific nature of archaeological and historic research. It's just making it yet another set of fairy tales about a particular thing with no fact whatsoever about what the object is. And since all object analysis is generally done with the object as the center of attention, a wrong identification based on a wrong provenance is problematic on an entire chain of sequences. So wrong identification or faulty attribution of an object is absolutely the death of archaeological and art historic research. And it not only affects what is written about the object or how the object will be understood in the future, it also affects the credibility of museum as a resource for research. Because if tomorrow a researcher is found to be incorrect in their analysis, they can very easily tell you that I did nothing wrong. It was that museum. That's what the museum provenance says. That's what the official record at the museum says this object is. So I may be faulty, but my faulty interpretation is the result of museum's faulty identification. So if the provenance is wrong, the stakes are not just very high for the researcher writing about the object. The stakes are equally high for the museum housing that particular object and getting the provenance wrong in the first place. Now, you might come to me and say, well, what is the recourse? What does the museum do? In a situation like this, what can a museum do? A museum has thousands of objects. On a daily basis, there's just so many things in the museum. And how does the museum get out of this vicious circle of wrong provenance and faulty identification? So here are a few measures that I have thought of in the last so many years working with Ashtanayikas, Darpandharanis, and also other objects that have been wrongly identified. Number one, have a frequent revision of object biographies. Periodically invite people, and by people I mean experts. Invite people who specialize in a particular field, get them to comment on the object. Because everybody would have invariably read something different. A museum curator is not all-knowing. A gallery curator is not all-knowing. He may know about some certain things in the gallery. He may not know everything about every object in the particular gallery assigned to him or her. So what you need to do is periodically have these kinds of exhibitions or seminars where you invite scholars who specialize in a particular kind of object and tell them to revise object biographies. So tell them to come up with their inputs. Involve object analysts from specific areas of research. So let's say your museum houses stone tools. Get a stone tool analyst, get a Paleolithic archaeologist who specializes in stone tools, get them involved and get them to revise your provenance. Look at things, study things. It might surprise you that in some of the big universities in India, there are Paleolithic tools housed, and mode 2 tools have been classified as mode 3 and mode 3 have been classified as mode 4. And even though these are within museum departments, within departments of archaeology and anthropology, despite having so many scholars, so many doctoral fellows, postdoctoral fellows, and students and researchers, the object has been wrongly provenanced. So a student looking at it might get the wrong impression of mode 1, mode 2, mode 3 technologies altogether, right? So the periodic revision of object biographies is very, very important. And for that, you need to have seminars and capacity building programs where you are involving specialists from the field to comment on it. Rather than relying on your set of people or your set of employees, get more people involved who might specialize in a particular kind of object and get them to look at your collections, specific elements of your collections, and see if there is any weight to their criticism of your object biographies. The second thing that museums need to do is create an online database and make provenance more transparent and accessible to researchers. Not just researchers, but scholars worldwide. And here I take a leaf out of Ashmolean Museum's notebook. I've been very fortunate to have worked, trained, and interned under Ashmolean in my lifetime. And Ashmolean has this branch called the Yusuf Jamil Center for Islamic and Asian Art. So essentially all Asian art, anything that deals with our part of the world, is in the Yusuf Jamil Center. And they have this extensive online catalog. All you need to do is look at an object and at the museum and come back with a picture, put it on Google Lens, and this will yield you this particular result. And when you open their online collection, you find everything about the object right next to the picture of the object. So if you saw this man in mourning in the Gandhara Gallery at Ashmolean, you would not only know what period it comes from and where it comes from, you would have all the details, including what material it's made of, what is its index, what kind of dimensions does it have, what is its accession number, was it purchased by the museum, has it been loaned to the museum, what is the entire object biography, so to speak. And online databases like these, which make provenance more accessible to the researchers, are extremely useful on a lot of levels. Not only does this help you digitize your provenance record and update things from handheld registers and paper into an online repository, it makes it easy to edit, because all you really need to do is a little bit of coding and edit and make any changes that there might be. It makes you provide better provenance cards. It also reduces the chunky display provenance cards. So you don't really have to have huge provenance cards on the display case itself. If your museum has a website and the website has everything about the object that needs to be known. So while a random visitor or a tourist can come and enjoy the object for as it is and take pictures and selfies with it without bothering about what the object was, a researcher can very easily go to your repository, look up the object's details, and use them for their research. Similarly, if any discrepancy pops up, rather than manually making change in a register from 1960, it's much easier to go onto a website and change the coding for the object and add all the details that you need. So this is a very effective and sort of a cost-effective move to get your objects right, to get your provenance right. Another thing that can be done, and here we have Diptarka, who's also in the organizing committee of the session, is make museums more accessible to researchers. Now, museums have predominantly a problem in some countries of the world, is they're not researcher friendly at all. You go to a museum, you want a particular picture, and they'd be like, if you want it from our collection, we're going to charge you this amount of money to just look at the object. And if you want to photograph it, it's maybe $500 more to take a picture. That is not really researcher friendly. For a person who has to study 200 objects of the same category, let's say 200 Gandhara artifacts, how much money do you expect that researcher to pay? And remember that researcher is going to be a scholar at a university or a postdoctoral fellow with some department. And he doesn't have that kind of money to throw away on objects of the bygone era. So what museums essentially need to do is be more researcher friendly. And how they can do it is by making their archives more accessible, by letting researchers hold seminars and discussions. You may, if you want, get the researcher to sign a permission form from you, but let researchers converge in a museum gallery and have a discussion about objects. Let them talk about different objects, their provenance, and talk about discrepancies, And then as a museum setup, take feedback from the researchers as well as to what they found out. Now, this is something interestingly that is done a lot in the UK. When you look at museums, they're very research friendly. People, artists can all walk into museums, and you might just stumble upon somebody in the British Museum sketching a particular piece to practice their fine art. Similarly, you might find somebody in the British Museum library just casually walking in and trying to look up a particular object, say the talks. The curators themselves are very easily accessible. You have their emails online, and all you need to do is type them an email, and they'll get back to you with whatever they have, and they will assist you in whatever way they can. But this is not essentially true for other countries in the world. And that also needs to be done, because how would a curator find out about a change in the object that they've been hosting? How would National Museum, for instance, find out that what they've described as Mohini is actually just a Darpan Dharani figurine? By talking to researchers. And how will they talk to researchers if they're more accessible to the researchers? And how will they become more accessible to the researchers? By inviting researchers primarily to have those kind of dialogues, to engage in those kind of workshops, and then getting back to you with feedback. So the red tapeism that exists between the museum authorities and the researcher on the field needs to be reduced a little bit. We can't force all curators to go read all the primary texts there are about a particular artifact. It's just preposterous. So rather than expecting your curator to be an all-knowing entity, which is ridiculously what a lot of people believe curators should do, know everything there is under the sun, which is not humanly possible, just get curators to engage in a healthy dialogue with researchers. Make curators more accessible and make researchers more accessible, but more importantly, on a wider scale, make museums more researcher-friendly, so that researchers don't feel like, oh, I have to go here and pay so much amount of money. I don't have that kind of money because I'm a student. Hence, I'm not going to go to the museum at all. I'm just going to rely on secondary sources and write something new altogether based on paper A, paper B, paper C, without seeing the actual artifact. So researchers' observations, their results, should be made transparent to museums, and that will only be possible if the museum is more inviting to researchers. Now, another thing that museums need to do to correct provenance is adherence to primary texts and latest scholarly research. Again, I've just negated this point. I firmly hold that the curator is not an all-knowing entity. And I don't suggest that curators should be at their desk all day reading research paper after research paper on one object after the other, but have people intern for you, maybe have students intern for you, and get them a particular piece of your gallery to curate and to work on. Get this particular individual to probably just sort Pahadi miniatures, for example, and not just all Pahadi miniatures, but a particular kind of Pahadi miniatures. So maybe get somebody and tell them to read about the Ashtanaikas, find out all the latest research, plus study all the primary text, and then probably create a presentation about wrong identification, wrong provenance. Bring it to the fore, bring it to the table so that the museum can correct its provenance. It gladdens me immensely to say that Birla Academy of Art and Culture has done exactly that. And I'm very, very happy that this initiative has been taken up by at least one museum that I know of, which is getting a person to intern with them and getting that person to focus on wrong provenance of something, and not just making them do a preliminary exercise or, making them do a PowerPoint presentation on it, but actually encouraging them to file that report with the museum so that the museum can look into it and then can correct their provenance later on. Wrong identification happens all the time. And identification always matters on who the museum was consulting at the time that the object was acquired. The museum may have consulted just one person for everything. It may have consulted different people, and some of them may have had a faulty interpretation. But getting an intern, and museums have internships all the time, getting an intern to work on a particular kind of object to revise the provenance is also a brilliant drill. And here, there are a few secondary papers that have been written on similar topics. So there is Medha Sharma's paper that came out in the Speaking Archaeologically Journal, Volume 4, on the implications of faulty provenance. But there is equally also my paper on Ashtanaikas, how the approach to Ashtanaikas can be improved, and how studying Lady with the Mirror can be improved with quantitative databases and with visually sorting material. And if people were to read not just these papers, but there's so many papers on provenance and improving provenance, if there were specialized individuals hired by museums to do that, things would become a lot more easier. And then classifying all that into a digital repository, making it more research friendly, and having a continuous dialogue between researchers and museum authorities. I think it's a problem, but it's not a problem that can't be tackled effectively. So what do we do? Because you might just come to me and tell me you've been harping on about it. What have you done so far to give us such pravachans about what to do about wrong provenance? At Speaking Archaeologically, which is my organization, which is where I take in research students and teach them archaeological basics, we hold periodic object-specific workshops at museums. We held a Gandhara-specific workshop at the Indian Museum, Kolkata. And we do this periodically across all museums in India. So wherever we can, we hold a workshop whenever possible. And we generally make it object-specific. So it's not like you have one day, go through the whole museum. It's like you have one day, go through just one gallery and look at one particular kind of objects at that museum, so that you can look into it deeply and you can research on it on a deeper level, also understand the objects on a deeper level. These are public archaeology workshops. They're not just restricted to members within Speaking Archaeologically or students of Speaking Archaeologically. They're public archaeology ventures. Anybody can come and join us and can take part in these workshops. We then go back home with everything that we've collected during a day, and then we curate them into these quantitative databases that you see. This is essentially what I was talking about, visually arranging the data that you have about the object. What this does is, if there are two objects that look incredibly similar but have been provenanced differently in two different museums, because they've been visually sorted together, you can then tell the wrong object from the right one, or wrongly provenanced object from the right one. It's very, very easy to correct provenance if you have so many objects listed before you. In the presentations that I showed, in the slides that I showed you, you had one picture and I was telling you that this was wrongly identified and this is what its correct identification is. But just imagine that you had a complete table here where you just had the Ashtanaikas. Now, if you have 10 samples of Utka Naika and one sample calling the same image exactly alike, the Vesakka Saja instead of Utka, you suddenly know that this is the wrong identification. Right? So visually sorting this becomes very, very important. And at Speaking Archaeologically, this is an exercise we undertake without fail. We use the EpiCollect database building management system, but we also use MS Excel when we are technologically not so good, or when we are in a situation where we can't access EpiCollect. But we put all of this into a visual sorted material, and then it's easier to sort images and tell the wrong provenance from the right one. We then sit down together and we debate objects, identifications, and provenance by questioning what we've observed. So usually there's a set of questions that we all go through. It's generally in a huge document that says, what have you seen? What is it wearing? Why do you think the person being depicted is important? If it's an object, of course, if it's a person being depicted. But if it's something else, it's always like, okay, what have you seen which is like this? That helps you trace the object biography also. It also helps you trace influences. It helps you trace things that may have percolated into art from other cultures or other culturally similar assimilations. So sitting and debating object identifications, the object provenance, but also addressing questions about what you see, what you observe, is very, very important when you're dealing with objects. When you're doing object analysis, this is predominantly the most important thing that you can do. And that's something that we also do. And once we have sufficient data, we sit down, we research, we collate on it, and we try to make our data publicly accessible. Every year, we publish a journal called the Speaking Archaeologically Journal, for the want of a better name. And invariably, every year, there is always a paper on objects. This could be any kind of objects. Sometimes it's jewelry, sometimes it's traditional ornaments, sometimes it's a sculpture, sometimes it's a painting, sometimes it's the whole issue of faulty provenance and its implication in archaeology. But the 5 journals that we have so far, and the 6th one that's just about to release, provenance of objects has been the primary thirst at Speaking Archaeologically, because we want to talk about this. We want to have this dialogue, which is extremely, extremely important for archaeological analysis of objects and material culture studies. So in the end, and I promise you this is the end, I'm very, very grateful to my team at Speaking Archaeologically, because they've been meticulously recording and collecting data from museums across the world. And they've been helping me set the record straight by getting all this information on EpiCollect, by working on research papers, by looking at specific objects and coming up with things, and by going to conferences and bringing that data out there. So creating a veritable research impact with what we've done in these museums and in these workshops. I'm also immensely grateful, and I said that at the very beginning, to the Birla Academy of Art and Culture for inviting me to speak on this topic. I think anybody who's heard me publicize about this talk tonight has heard me say that this is a topic I feel very strongly about. As an object analyst, this is the biggest bane of my life, that objects are wrongly provenance, wrongly understood, and then research is carried out on a completely wrong footing. So I felt so strongly about this. I've written papers that were published in 2019 and 2020. And a paper that I had personally supervised was Implication of Faulty Provenance in Archaeological Research by Medha Sharma. And she was working in Speaking Archaeologically, and I supervised her paper. All this time, it was extremely, extremely important for me that somebody told me to talk about it to a museum authority. So yes, we've gone on and written that. But researchers do that. Researchers go and they write stuff. But does that stuff ever make it to the museum's ears? So to me, this opportunity that a museum invited me to talk about one thing that I felt I needed to have a dialogue about with museum authorities was an immensely amazing opportunity. And I'm so thankful to the entire team and all the organizers that they enabled this particular session and enabled me to talk about this so passionately and so volubly about it for so long. So thank you so much for your time and attention, everybody. Here is a selected bibliography, very short for the purpose of convenience. And in case anybody wants to look more into it, please let me know. And I look forward to your questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that very interesting lecture. And I'm so sorry I'm not able to turn on my camera because of some network issue. But your lecture was very insightful, and that's also very evident because we have a number of questions in the comment box, which we will be taking up. But I had something as an observation from your lecture. So you were talking about how sometimes different people that the museum consults can give very different interpretations of the same object, and that can also keep changing over time. So this is also something I've noticed while working with the BAAC's collection, that there is this one object which has been